This month, Russia suffered one of the harshest economic blows since the war in Ukraine began. But this strike didn't come from tanks, missiles, or artillery. Instead, it was delivered by a different kind of weapon: bureaucrats. Armed with spreadsheets, maritime lawyers, and sanctioning orders, the UK and EU launched another wave of coordinated economic warfare, targeting Russia's so-called shadow fleet. This ghost armada of aging oil tankers has become a financial lifeline for both Russia and President Vladimir Putin. Now, it is under assault not by firepower, but by carefully crafted restrictions. This is modern warfare in its sharpest form, crippling one of the largest militaries on Earth without firing a single shot. It is economic combat designed to cut deeply into Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine, both in the near term and far into the future. On July 18th, the European Union unleashed what could only be described as a sanctions bombshell, its 18th package of restrictions against Russia. This time, the measures were not just symbolic additions to a growing list. They fundamentally rewrote the rules of the game. Europe introduced, for the very first time, a dynamic oil price cap. Instead of a fixed ceiling, the price would now adjust to market conditions. Early reports indicated that the cap would fall from $60 per barrel to around $47.60 starting September 3rd, one of the largest enforced drops in recent memory. The catch? This decrease applies only to oil originating in Russia or sold by third parties carrying Russian crude. Major exporters such as Norway, Canada, or the United States are exempt. The intent was clear. The economic crosshairs are squarely on Moscow. But the real shock came only 3 days later. On July 21st, UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy announced Britain's largest ever maritime sanctions package. It directly targeted 2 companies and 135 oil tankers, vessels that had together moved several millions worth of Russian oil since early 2024. This wasn't random. British intelligence had pinpointed these ships using advanced tracking systems capable of detecting sanctions evasion, even when Russian operators tried to go dark. The real significance, however, lay in the entities chosen for sanctions. Intershipping Services LLC, a company notorious for registering shadow fleet vessels under Gabonese flags, was cut off from Western financial networks. Alone, this company had been facilitating nearly $10 billion worth of Russian transport every year. Meanwhile, Litasco Middle East DMCC, a Dubai-based arm of Lukoil, also lost its access to crucial maritime services. Lukoil, Russia's third-largest firm and a global energy giant before the war, had already been pushed back from operating in over 30 countries to barely 14. The new sanctions threatened to reduce that number even further, choking off Moscow's reach abroad. What made the timing brutal was that these sanctions arrived just as Russia entered peak shipping season, when winter fuel deliveries to Asia are most critical. By some estimates, more than 444 ships were suddenly affected, including the 135 directly linked to the 2 sanctioned companies. Many would now be forced into longer, costlier routes, or, in some cases, rendered unable to operate at all. To truly grasp why the July 2025 sanctions hit Russia so hard, we need to understand how Moscow built and operated its shadow fleet in the first place. This network of ships quickly evolved into one of the world's most sophisticated sanctions evasion systems, exploiting nearly every loophole in international maritime law. The fleet's origins trace back to early 2022, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered the first wave of Western sanctions on its energy exports. Faced with a collapsing economic lifeline, Moscow urgently needed to keep oil flowing to the few markets willing to buy. The answer was to hide in plain sight, leveraging the immense complexity of global shipping. Russia began with its merchant navy, already one of the largest in the world, comprising over 976 general cargo ships and nearly 387 dedicated oil tankers. But not every vessel was fit for covert operations. The perfect shadow tanker had to be old enough to blend in with the world's pool of aging ships, yet young and sturdy enough to endure long voyages across oceans. The sweet spot was usually between 15 and 25 years old, ships that had changed owners several times, but weren't yet destined for the scrapyard. Once selected, the real trick was disguising them. Russia relied heavily on flags of convenience. By re-registering tankers under countries with weak oversight and minimal regulations, these vessels could slip through scrutiny. Gabon quickly became a favorite destination for registration, offering paperwork with virtually no questions asked. That's why Britain specifically sanctioned a Gabonese-linked company in July. A Russian-owned ship would be reflagged under Gabon, renamed to sound African, and issued documents that hid its true origins. The deception didn't end there. To conceal movements, Shadow Fleet ships often turned off their automatic identification system, AIS, the maritime equivalent of shutting off GPS. They could remain dark for days or even weeks, vanishing from satellite scans. When they re-emerged, it was usually in international waters, where they engaged in ship-to-ship transfers. Picture this. In the middle of the ocean, one Russian tanker pumps oil into another vessel, often under a completely different flag, instantly rewriting the cargo's paper trail. What began as Russian crude suddenly appears to be Gabonese or Maltese oil, legally distinct and harder to trace. Insurance added another layer to the scheme. Since Western insurers refused to cover sanction-breaking voyages, operators turned to Russian providers, or even firms in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, landlocked countries that somehow emerged as maritime insurers. The coverage was minimal, sometimes meaningless, but it gave just enough paperwork to pass casual checks at ports. By mid-2025, maritime intelligence companies like Vortexa and Windward estimated Russia commanded nearly 1,100 dedicated shadow vessels, along with another 900 gray fleet ships suspected of occasional sanction violations. Together, these ships carried almost 17% of global oil shipments. That figure reveals everything. If nearly a fifth of world trade is moving through the shadows, it shows just how dependent Moscow has become on this hidden lifeline. Oil and gas revenues have long been the backbone of Russia's federal income, accounting for anywhere between 30% to 50% of government revenue and generating well over $100 billion annually during strong market years. When the first waves of Western sanctions hit in 2023, that stream collapsed almost overnight. Russia's energy income dropped by more than 40%, plunging Moscow into a fiscal crisis. The Shadow Fleet was Putin's answer. And for a time, it worked surprisingly well. By 2024, this covert network of tankers was estimated to have generated an additional $9.4 billion in revenue, money Russia would have otherwise lost if it complied with sanctions. To put that in perspective, this sum equaled nearly 15% of Russia's pre-war military budget, enough to keep the war in Ukraine funded for several months. But the fleet's success carried hidden costs that are now becoming painfully visible. Transporting oil to Asia rather than Europe adds $10.15 per barrel in extra shipping expenses. Buyers in India and China also demanded steep discounts on Russian Urals crude to compensate for both higher transport costs and the risks of sanctions. Instead of a quick delivery to Europe that took only a few days, a tanker bound for India could take over a month at sea. This meant capital was tied up far longer, reducing efficiency and cutting into profits. The inefficiencies multiplied quickly, with Russia exporting nearly 5 million barrels of oil every single day. Even a $1 additional cost per barrel translated in a $5 million lost daily revenue. Beyond transportation, the operational costs of running the Shadow Fleet mounted relentlessly. Aging ships required more maintenance. Insurance from secondary providers was expensive but still unreliable, and long-haul voyages meant higher fuel and crew costs. By 2025, these inefficiencies had begun eroding much of the extra revenue the Shadow Fleet once generated. Meanwhile, Russia's federal budget revealed the deepening strain. Military spending consumed almost one-third of total government expenditure, roughly $142 billion. When combined with national security and law enforcement, over 40% of all spending went to defense. A third of that budget was classified and hidden from public view. This level of military investment hadn't been seen in major economies since World War II. But pouring so many resources into war-starved Russia's civilian sectors. Infrastructure projects outside defense crumbled. Healthcare and education suffered severe cutbacks. And jobs across the economy were funneled into military-related industries. The official unemployment rate sank to just 2.3%, the lowest since 1991. On paper, that looks like success. But in reality, it signaled a crisis. Companies struggled desperately to recruit, competing for a shrinking pool of workers. Middle-class families emigrated in growing numbers, while the military continued to draw heavily from the workforce. The July 2025 sanctions only made this worse. With oil prices in Europe expected to fall by 20% in September, Moscow's options narrowed. Either it reduced short-haul fleet operations in Europe, sacrificing volume for smaller returns, or it shifted even more exports to Asia at greater expense. Neither option looked sustainable. If Russia tried to funnel more of its oil to India and China, it faced yet another problem: bargaining power. With Europe increasingly cutting itself off from Russian crude, Beijing and New Delhi held all the cards. They could demand steeper discounts simply because Moscow had nowhere else to go. The fewer buyers Russia had, the weaker its position became. Pipeline alternatives weren't much of a lifeline either. Eastern European states had access to the Baku, Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which stretched from Azerbaijan through Georgia to Turkey, bypassing Russian exports. And Ukraine's military added more pressure by directly targeting Russian refineries and pipelines near its borders and across the Caucasus. This steadily degraded Russia's ability to rely on overland transport instead of maritime routes. If the sanctions really managed to keep as many as 444 vessels from operating, Russia could tumble into a logistical crisis at the exact moment global demand for winter fuel peaked. The reduced fleet would be forced to carry more loads with fewer, older, and less reliable ships, all under heavier surveillance by Western enforcement agencies. The dynamic price cap imposed by Europe only deepened the challenge. Unlike static sanctions, this cap adjusted automatically to counter Moscow's evasions. If Russia attempted to sell above market prices through backdoor deals, the cap would drop further, dragging other buyers' offers down with it. The result was a kind of pricing death spiral, where Russian crude became less competitive with each attempt to break the rules. Eventually, Moscow would be forced into deeper discounts, draining away its revenue even faster. China's role also carried hidden costs. While Beijing had not formally joined Western sanctions, its banks grew increasingly cautious. By late 2024, nearly 98% of Chinese banks rejected direct yuan payments from Russia, fearing they might face secondary sanctions from the West. This forced Russian traders to rely on expensive alternative payment methods, each adding more costs to every transaction. And remember, this was already the 18th EU sanctions package. Each new layer didn't just squeeze profits. It made operations more tangled, more expensive, and riskier to sustain. If the war and sanctions dragged on, maintaining the shadow fleet might soon become uneconomical for Russia, except for only the most critical exports. The long-term consequences extended far beyond tanker routes. They threatened to reshape Russia's entire strategic position in the second half of the decade. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of these sanctions is Russia's growing isolation from global maritime systems. The shadow fleet depends on aging ships, questionable insurance, and layers of deception. Over time, these practices make Russia increasingly incompatible with legitimate international trade. As enforcement methods grow more advanced and widespread, Moscow risks being gradually locked out of global shipping networks altogether. There's also the issue of shipbuilding. In 2023, Russia's state bank took control of the United Shipbuilding Corporation, USC, which operated 40 shipyards and employed nearly 95,000 workers. But sanctions cut off vital imported components, leaving USC unable to complete many projects. Now, with Russia relying heavily on older tankers for its shadow operations, the demand for new vessels has plummeted. Shipyards are being forced to survive on low-paying military contracts, straining their finances even further. Without legitimate global trade, the incentive to modernize or expand shipbuilding almost disappears. Even if the current sanctions don't fully cripple Russia in the short term, their compounding effect is undeniable. Layer after layer of restrictions, combined with years of economic stagnation, could gradually bring Moscow's capacity to conduct foreign trade to a breaking point. And the vulnerabilities of the shadow fleet only multiply as time passes. The older these ships become, the harder it is to ensure them, even with questionable providers. Maintenance grows costlier, failures more frequent, and scrutiny more intense. Adding to this is the rapid rise of AI-powered detection systems. These technologies now scan global shipping routes in near real time, flagging suspicious activity that once slipped through unnoticed. The UK's Nordic Warden operation has become a centerpiece of this effort. It uses AI to monitor 22 critical maritime zones, including the English Channel, North Sea, Kattegat, and Baltic Sea. By combining satellite imagery, AIS tracking, thermal readings, and predictive analytics, it can identify suspicious vessels with stunning accuracy. Meanwhile, platforms like Windward Maritime AI can track more than 1,100 shadow ships by cross-referencing satellite data, port records, and insurance databases. Even when ships try to go dark by disabling AIS, AI can detect them through their thermal signatures and wake patterns, then match those against known vessel registries. Technology is steadily tipping the balance. Each advancement makes it harder and more costly for Russia to keep its shadow fleet hidden. Russia hasn't been passive in this contest. Its countermeasures at sea have grown more desperate and more elaborate. Some vessels now carry multiple transponders, switching them on and off to create fake electronic identities. Others employ GPS spoofing, broadcasting false coordinates to mislead satellites. The most complex operations even involve several ships working together, electronically swapping identities while still at sea. But these tricks often end up backfiring. GPS spoofing, for example, can be uncovered by comparing signals from different satellite systems, exposing discrepancies instantly. Ships that juggle multiple transponders create electronic fingerprints that actually make them easier to track than legitimate single-signal vessels. The broader technological trend is clear. Detection is outpacing deception. Just as on the battlefield in Ukraine, Western intelligence tools are increasingly outmatching Russian countermeasures. That's why Europe and its allies believe the Shadow Fleet will become progressively harder and more expensive for Moscow to sustain. Of course, sanctions only matter if they're enforced internationally. A single wave won't cripple Russia unless it's backed by coordinated global action. Fortunately for the EU, it is already part of a multinational web with the resources and political will to act. The Repo Task Force brings together the US, UK, EU, Canada, Japan, and Australia, enabling their financial intelligence units to share data on sanctions evasion. This cross-border cooperation allows enforcement agencies to identify and strike at Russia's networks much faster. In March, these same nations launched a dedicated Shadow Fleet task force. When British intelligence identifies a suspect operator in Dubai, that information flows almost instantly to EU regulators, the US Treasury, and other G7 partners. Within weeks, sanctions can hit the entire network instead of just a single ship. Regional initiatives add another layer of pressure. The Nordic-Baltic 8++ group coordinates efforts to safeguard vital undersea infrastructure, like pipelines and communication cables, while also tightening regional enforcement against shadow vessels. With each passing month, this web of cooperation grows denser. For Russia, finding gaps to exploit is becoming far more difficult. As Moscow drifts deeper into geopolitical isolation, even smaller nations, those accounting for just a sliver of its exports, are starting to follow Europe's lead. Many are now looking for alternate suppliers rather than risk entanglement with sanctioned Russian energy. By the autumn of 2025, when the latest sanctions are fully implemented, and with more almost certain to come in 2026, Russia could face a severe economic decline. Its war effort has already shifted into a grinding war of attrition. But if sanctions continue to bite, the question may soon shift from whether Russia can win to whether it can even sustain the fight without triggering its own economic collapse. The long-term consequences of these measures are clear. Every new sanction, every tightened regulation, and every piece of advanced monitoring technology pushes Russia further into a corner. The Shadow Fleet, once hailed inside Moscow as a clever workaround to Western restrictions, is slowly becoming an economic trap. Its very existence now bleeds money, consumes resources, and exposes Russia to growing vulnerabilities. As sanctions compound, Russia risks not just shrinking profits, but the potential collapse of its overseas trade networks. Its reliance on outdated tankers, flimsy insurance, and deceptive paperwork is no longer sustainable in a world where AI, satellite monitoring, and multinational intelligence sharing are closing every loophole. Even if Putin's regime manages to keep the war going for some time, the economic foundation behind it is steadily eroding. With a third of its federal budget poured into defense and vast sums burned keeping the shadow fleet alive, other critical sectors, education, healthcare, infrastructure, are being starved. This strategy of survival through shadow trading may have bought Russia time. But now, time itself has turned into an enemy. For Europe and its allies, the goal is simple: strangle the shadow fleet until Moscow loses the ability to fuel its war machine. For Russia, the danger is just as clear. Once the fleet collapses, so too may the economy that supports its war effort. The ultimate question is no longer if the sanctions will work, but when. Will they weaken Russia quickly enough to force an end to the war before desperation drives Moscow into even more dangerous and unpredictable actions?